What happened to the advancer? Oh, here it is. And I'd like to especially thank Brittany because she put all the, and Whitney, they put all the binders together, and that's an incredible pain in the backside to get all those things printed out and ordered and put into those binders. So let's thank them real quick. Okay, I'm wrapping things up inside, then we're going to head out to the farm and we'll look at the paddocks and see how well you guys did. They took the animals out at 1 o'clock today. When I went out at 6 this morning, everybody was still where they were supposed to be, so I was pretty happy about that. Sometimes that doesn't happen. So the last topic that I wanted to wrap the grazing school up with is rejuvenating rundown pastures. And a lot of you, especially if you're moving back to the farm or you just bought a small farm, you're buying a farm that's been neglected for a while. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to take you to Kate and Justin Adams' farm to take a look at their farm, because that's where they started at. And I would encourage you to come to that field day in May if you have a chance. So what I want to do with this presentation is kind of lay out a framework that will kind of help you make some decisions as you move forward in terms of how do you proceed with a farm that's in less than ideal condition. So I always like to start out and ask, why do we lose stands? Why do we lose stands on farms? A lot of times we blame it on too little or too much water. We either talk about flooding, or a lot of times we talk about drought, and that's the reason that my pasture died. But in reality, it's a whole bunch of things, and probably one of the primary issues is grazing management and fertility management. Those are two underlying things that really compromise pastures. And then a drought comes along, and our pasture dies, and we said, well, the drought killed our pasture. No, we probably were well on our way to dying because we had poor fertility in our pastures and we had poor grazing management in our pastures, and the drought was kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back. Sometimes we choose forage species that are less than ideal, and I deal with this, especially with hay producers, quite commonly. Hay producers love to grow Timothy hay because horse people love Timothy hay, but it's just not adapted here. So when we choose a forage species that's less than well adapted to our region, we're going to be in trouble right from the very start. And that's something Matt just alluded to when he said, well, you know, tall fescue may not be the best, but it's the best adapted here. And that's probably going to be our primary forage base, whether we love it or hate it. And then we have other things like weed infestations. We sometimes will have some insects and disease problems in terms of forage. Weed infestations, we often say, well, this weed took our pasture over. Well, weeds are normally a symptom of a problem rather than a problem themselves, right? So a lot of times we get weeds in pastures when we have an open space in a pasture. And that comes from things like poor fertility management, poor grazing management, or if we're in a hayfield, poor mowing management. And we leave an open space, and the good Lord doesn't leave an open space long. Something's going to grow in there, and it's usually a weed. So weeds are often a symptom of a problem rather than a problem themselves. So it's usually more than one thing going on. Now, when we talk about pasture renovation, all of this is always the first thing that comes to our mind, reseeding our pastures. But there's a lot of steps before that need to happen for this to be successful, if we need to. A lot of times we can revitalize a pasture just by changing our management style within that pasture. So, and that's what we want to talk about today, is kind of an integrated approach to restoring pasture productivity. So we're going to start out and talk about soil fertility. And I know Dr. Grove talked a little bit about soil fertility on day one, but it's so important that we get that base fertility in that pasture if we're going to be successful with everything else. We're going to talk about just mentioned forage species selection, and then we're going to talk a little bit about grazing management and the role that it plays in having a healthy and productive pasture. And then a really important one is overseeding legumes. If we want to make a sustainable grazing system, we've got to try to decouple ourselves from applying a lot of fertilizer in that system. So once we build our P&K up, the primary nutrient that we're going to be missing in a grazing system is going to be nitrogen, and that's where legumes can really play an important role in a sustainable and productive system. And then we'll talk about reseeding, and reseeding is kind of really your last resort. So that's the last thing that you need to do in this kind of integrated approach to restoring pasture productivity. So let's start out and talk about soil fertility. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this because it's so absolutely critical that we get this right when we start to rejuvenate a rundown farm. I always like to mention soil, and Dr. Grove did a good job talking about soil yesterday. And this is a definition from a very classical text. If you ever had soils in college, you probably used this text. And the way they define a soil is a dynamic natural body composed of mineral and organic solids, gases, liquids, and living organisms. And often we forget about those living organisms in the soil. We talk about sand, silt, and clay, and the proportion of the sand, silt, and clay, and how that determines soil texture and so forth. But a healthy soil is going to be teeming with life, and that's important to understand as we move forward. And when we start to go through this regenerative or this rejuvenation process, we're going to be impacting not just above the ground, but what's in the ground too, so the root system of the plant, and then all the other things that live in that soil. And when we start to do a good job and get things to where they need to be, we're going to increase that life in the soil. This was put together by Ed Rayburn at West Virginia University, and he took an acre of soil and kind of looked at the living things in it. So if we look at this, if we look at 1 acre of soil, what's below the ground, we've got about 2,500 pounds of plant roots per acre. We've got bacteria in a healthy soil that's going to be over 2,000 pounds per acre. So think about that. Something that you have to look through a microscope and see there's going to be a ton of that per acre in a healthy soil. We got actinomycetes and fungi, and those are going to be in 2,000 and 6,000 pounds of fungi per acre. I mean, that's really phenomenal when we think about that. And then we've got other things like protozoa and nematodes and mites and earthworms, 625 pounds of earthworms per acre in a healthy pasture soil. That's pretty amazing. And when we rejuvenate a soil and we get these things where they need to be, all of a sudden we're starting stronger nutrient cycles. All these things are involved in nutrient cycling and breaking things down and releasing nutrients back into the system that can be used by the plant again. So when we talk about soil fertility, I think one important thing to understand is Liebig's law of the minimum. And what it's saying is that the level of plant production can be no greater than that allowed by the most limiting essential plant growth factor. So there's lots of different essential plant growth factors, and a lot of those are soil fertility related. Things like phosphorus and potassium, nitrogen, acidity, soil acidity, moisture and temperature can be, whatever's the most limiting is going to hold overall pasture production back. So, for example, if I have a farm and I have a very low phosphorus level, I can add a lot of potash to it, I can add nitrogen to it, but we're never going to optimize production until we find what's deficient and fix that deficient essential plant growth factor. Now, one of the most beautiful things about a well-managed grazing system is that we can develop very strong and persistent nutrient cycles within that grazing system. So when we start out with a farm that's kind of run down, we've got to build that fertility up. And then once we build that fertility up, we can reduce the amount of fertility inputs going into that farm because we've developed a strong nutrient cycle. So in this nutrient cycle, we have inputs, so those are nutrients that come into the farm. They can be in the form of fertilizer. If we're in an organic operation, that could be broiler litter or other manure products. Nitrogen is coming in via legumes in a well-managed grazing system. And anything we feed in that grazing system, hay, concentrate feed, mineral supplements, they're all entering this nutrient cycle. And plants grow, the animals graze the plants, and these nutrients get cycled within the system. About 80 to 90% of the nutrients that go in the front end of the animal come out the back end of the animal, and that's important to remember. So, and that's one of the most beautiful things about a well-managed grazing system is that we can build these strong nutrient cycles, which kind of decouples us from adding a lot of soil fertility in the future. So in this nutrient cycle or export in a cow-calf system would be calves primarily and then cull cows. And if we look at the amount of nutrients removed by a cow-calf pair, this is some data from Missouri. We remove from a cow-calf pair about 10 pounds of nitrogen, 7 pounds of P2O5, and a pound of potash. So extremely low levels of nutrient removal in that calf. So if we put this over 2 acres, say we're stocked at 2 acres per cow-calf unit, I mean, all of a sudden we're removing 3.5 pounds of phosphorus and less than a pound of potash per acre per year. Now, we have some other losses in the system, but the point I want to make is that in a well-managed grazing system, we can really reduce the amount of fertilizer we need once we build those fertility levels up and we implement good grazing management. Now, even though we're removing small amounts of nutrients, we can redistribute nutrients within the grazing system. So if I have one big paddock, say this is 100 acres, and my animals are going out and they're grazing, and then they're coming back to what? Where do animals go to after they graze? Shade and water, right? Shade and water sources. So they come back there, they're lounging around the shade sources, get a drink of water, lay down, ruminate a little bit, and get up. What happens when they get up? The what? They're making a deposit, right? It's just like going to the bank. They're making a deposit, and over time what happens is we transfer nutrients from out in the pasture, just like Kevin showed, and concentrate them around shade and water sources, and anywhere where animals congregate at. So what do we do about that redistribution? Well, we can subdivide the pastures. We can work with NRCS, add some waters to these pastures, and then we put the animals in here and we say, you know, you can graze here, but you're going to have to deposit those nutrients back here. And when we implement rotational stocking, one of the things we don't talk enough about is that we get improved nutrient distribution within the grazing system. And that's really, really important for a sustainable grazing system, that we can build and maintain nutrients where they're supposed to be within pastures and not concentrate them close to the shade or water sources like Kevin showed in that real world example he gave this morning. Now, the other thing I want people to realize, and a lot of people don't realize this, is the amount of nutrients we do remove when we make hay. So when we make hay, so take orchard grass for example, and this is pounds of the nutrient per ton, we're removing 50 pounds of nitrogen, 17 pounds of P2O5, and 60 pounds of potash per acre. So say we had a good year, all of a sudden we're removing 3 times that. Say we had 3-ton hay yield. 150, 45 or 50 pounds of phosphorus and 180 pounds of potash. That's a lot of nutrients. We remove a lot of nutrients when we make hay. Often when we have a rundown or a farm that's been neglected, people have made hay there and they think they're doing the landowner a service by making hay there. And over time, the productivity of those hay fields go down and down and down because they don't treat it like it's their own. They just take all these nutrients off and don't put enough nutrients back. So a lot of times we'll have very low nutrient levels, especially on farms that have been hayed. So my point is this can go either way, right? So if I look at the value of those nutrients in hay, every ton of hay is going to have somewhere around $70 to $80 worth of nutrients at current nutrient prices. Every ton of hay. So I need to make the decision, if I've got a farm that I'm kind of revitalizing, do I make more hay on that farm? Do I buy those nutrients, or do I buy hay, bring it into the system, and along with the feeding value of that hay, I get those nutrients too in that hay? And then depending on how I feed those nutrients, or how I feed that hay, I can either capitalize on those nutrients, or if I feed all my hay in one corner of the pasture, I concentrate those nutrients in one area. So I'm a big proponent of moving your feeding points around. You don't have to bale graze like we talked about yesterday, but somehow you've got to move those feeding points around that pasture ideally. The other option would be to feed in a heavy use area and then haul that manure back out and spread it on the pasture. And some people will choose to do that, but there is significant nutrient loss when you choose that option. And I kind of covered this, but again, move your hay feeding points around. Always feed hay on your worst pastures. So if you have pastures that are really low in fertility, that's where you should be feeding your hay at to bring those nutrients within that grazing system. And we can even use hay as a tool to move nutrients around within a farm. So if we say we bought an old dairy farm, what would the nutrient levels be close to the milking platform? Would they be high or low? What? Where they milk the cows at, so where the barn is, they would tend to be high, closer to the barn, right? The further you get away from the barn, because it's easier to haul manure close to a barn, right? If you're in a dairy situation. So we could actually take nutrient concentrations that are high on the farm, harvest hay there, and then feed that hay on areas that are low on the farm. And over time, we can shift those nutrients around. Now, it's important to remember that using hay to bring nutrients into the grazing system is not like going to the co-op and buying a buggy full of fertilizer. Changes don't happen that fast, and that's really important to remember. So the starting point is always to get a soil test, and it quantifies phosphorus and potassium, but not nitrogen. It provides a baseline. Otherwise, we're just guessing what to put on. Most important when nutrient prices are high, because it really allows us to dial in our fertilizer applications and put on just what we need. So broiler litter we always think is a really good buy, right? It is a good buy, even at the higher cost now, if you need the phosphorus. If you don't need the phosphorus in broiler litter, it's not a real good deal at current prices. And then we just need to follow nutrient levels over time. You don't have to sample every year, but every 2 to 3 years you should get a soil sample from most of your pastures. And just make sure you get a good hay soil sample. Edwin talked about that yesterday. Generally, we want a soil sample to represent less than 20 acres. We want to be a 4-inch depth. And avoid atypical areas in grazing systems. So watering areas, anywhere where animals congregate at, shade areas, where I fed hay at, where I had a creep feeder at, anything where nutrients will concentrate at. And there's a nice little soil sampling publication in your binder. So make sure you do your paperwork, and then the first thing I always look at when I get my soil test back is the pH. And the pH has major ramifications on nutrient availability within the soil. There's 2 pHs reported there. The one we're interested in would be just the pH or the water pH on there. And that's where we want to, and that's the one that we want to use to think about whether we're in the right range or not. So soil acidity, of course, is a major factor in limiting production, not just in Kentucky, but the whole southeastern United States. If we don't do anything to our soils, they tend to go to acidic. And when they go acidic, 2 things happen. We reduce nutrient availability in the soil, and we'll show you a diagram of that in a minute, and we reduce nitrogen fixation in our legumes. So our legumes fix nitrogen from the air into a plant available form, and that process becomes less efficient at low pH. Liming neutralizes soil acidity and supplies calcium and magnesium. And then these are some ideal ranges. For most grass clover pastures, we want to be in the range of 6 to 6.4. If we're in that range, we're going to be in pretty good shape. If we're trying to grow a grass alfalfa mixture, we want to pop that up to about 6.5 to 6.8. And this is the impact that pH has on availability of nutrients in the soil. So over here, on your left-hand side would be a very acidic soil, and on the right-hand side would be a very alkaline soil. And as each one of those bars represents a different nutrient. The thicker the bar is, the more plant available that nutrient is. So if we look in the ideal pH range that we just talked about, 6 to 7, all of our major nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, calcium, magnesium, they're all the most plant available. When we get outside of that range, we start to decrease nutrient availability. This is the reason that it's so important to add lime to your system if you need lime. And the only way you're going to tell if you need lime is if you take a soil test. Okay, it gives us a lime recommendation here, and then your extension agent will come back and tell you how much lime to put on from a given quarry that's local in your county. Lime recommendations are made based on what we call 100% calcium carbonate equivalent. We don't have any quarries that produce 100% calcium carbonate equivalent lime. They're all in that range of somewhere between 60 and 70-some%. So they're going to adjust that lime value up for your given quarry. And then we look at phosphorus and potassium, P and K, and see what range you're in and how much you have. If you're in a medium soil test range, you're in pretty good shape. And just want to mention the soil test category, so we can say low or very low. And if you have phosphorus and potassium levels are in the low or very low range, that nutrient is going to be deficient in that we expect if you apply it, you're going to get a yield response to that fertilizer that you apply. If it's in a medium soil test range, you're not doing too bad. May be deficient some of the time, but not a lot. And you may get a yield response, but it's not 100% for sure. If we're in the medium range, especially towards the mid to high medium range, we're in pretty good shape in terms of fertility for pastures. If we're in the high range, that nutrient is not deficient, and chances of getting an economic yield response are pretty slim. In very high, we definitely don't want to put any fertilizer on. That can be an environmental problem. And that would happen somewhere where we had, say, repeated applications of broiler litter over years and years and years and years and built those soil nutrient levels up very high. Kevin showed a 600 this morning where it concentrated at one end of the pasture. That's a very high nutrient level, and that's one that we would definitely not want to see that high. Okay, this is kind of just a graphical depiction of this, and these are our soil test categories. The ideal spot to be would be teetering right between medium and high. If we're there, we know we're not limiting yield. You know, in the real world, if we're in that medium range, we may limit yield a little bit on the bottom end of the medium range, but not a lot. Where we don't want to be is in this low or very low range. That's where we really need to get fertilizer on that pasture because we're going to see an economic yield response to that additional fertilizer. And then we get recommendations on our soil tests. Talk just a little bit about legumes and grazing systems. Legumes form a symbiotic relationship with rhizobium bacteria. In this relationship, the bacteria get a place to live on the roots. In these nodules, they form nodules on the roots. And since it's a symbiotic relationship, the plant gets something from this relationship. And those rhizobium bacteria actually fix nitrogen from the air into a plant available form and share it with that plant. And in return, they get a place to live and they get a energy source through sucrose or sugar that's fixed in photosynthesis. The plant shares with the bacteria. So it's a symbiotic relationship. What's the percentage of nitrogen in the air we breathe right now that we're breathing? Any ideas? Boy, this is a good group. So about 78%. So we're breathing primarily nitrogen gas now. That nitrogen gas isn't available to the plant, but it's fixed to a plant available form through this symbiotic relationship with rhizobium bacteria. After photosynthesis, dinitrogen fixation or symbiotic nitrogen fixation is the second most important biochemical process on Earth. So when we add legumes, we tend to increase yields because we're bringing nitrogen in. We improve forage quality and hence animal performance. And we improve summer growth if we use a deep-rooted legume like alfalfa or Sericea lespedeza. And really important for us in tall fescue-based systems is that we tend to dilute the endophyte. We talk about the dilution effect, but we mentioned several times this last couple days that there's also other things going on that we don't fully understand yet in terms of reducing or reversing vasoconstriction that's caused by the ergot alkaloids in tall fescue. This is just some estimates of nitrogen fixed for different legumes. Some legumes are more efficient at fixing nitrogen than others. A good reason to have alfalfa in your system is that it's an aggressive nitrogen fixer and high in forage quality. So 150 to 250 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. That's a lot of nitrogen. At current nitrogen prices, which are somewhere between 50 cents and $1, we're looking at somewhere around, $150 per acre per year in the value of just nitrogen that alfalfa is fixing. And then as we get down into red clover and white clover and annual lespedeza, it's not quite as efficient at fixing nitrogen as alfalfa. Now, the important thing is we always think about, we think of nitrogen fixation as like putting a bag of fertilizer in a field, and it doesn't quite work like that. That nitrogen affixed by the legume has to get shared with the grass plant, and that happens indirectly. And in grazing systems, the animal is an important part of that process. So they eat the legume, and they use some of the nitrogen, but most of it gets excreted through the urine of the animal, right? So when the animal urinates on the pasture, we're recycling that nitrogen back into the system. And when that happens, that grass plant can use that nitrogen. So it's not direct sharing, so it's not like my legume plant and my grass plant are beside each other, and he says, hey buddy, can I get a little nitrogen? It's really an indirect sharing, and the animal's an important part of that sharing process. And then we also get death and decomposition of plant parts, and that's where all these things in the soil, earthworms and dung beetles and ants, they all work to break that plant material down and release those nutrients into the soil. So let's just talk a little bit about managing for legumes. So, and Ray kind of made a comment about this, and Dr. Blazer used to say at Virginia Tech that we need to really be managing for the legumes within the stand. And if we do that, then we're going to have a healthy grazing system. We want legumes to make up 20 to 30% of the sward on a dry matter basis. Sometimes we'll get a little bit more than that. If you see a stand that's 40% legumes on a dry matter basis, I mean, that's a lot of legumes in there. It almost looks like it's just legumes, even though there's a significant amount of grass in there. We want to lime and fertilize according to soil tests to create that environment in which those legumes can thrive. And most legumes tend to like a little higher soil fertility and a little bit higher soil pH. And if we have a low pH and low fertility situation, one legume we might consider would be annual lespedeza, or even Sericea lespedeza if it's present on the farm already. Both of those will do a little bit better under lower fertility. We can overseed legumes by frost seeding in late winter, and that's probably our most effective way to do it. 6 to 8 pounds of red clover, a pound or two of improved white clover, like a Ladino type white clover, a large white clover, and 10 pounds of annual lespedeza. You know, it's going to cost you somewhere between $20 and $30 an acre, depending on the seed price at the current time. Annual lespedeza was a little bit high. I found some for $2.69 a pound this winter, so it was a little bit more expensive than usual. We want to rotationally stock pastures. So most of our legumes will do better if we're managing grazing, just like our grasses. And I'm not going to say much about forage species. We talked about those yesterday, but I do want to stress the importance of choosing forage species that you know grow here. So a lot of people will move here from New York or California or Wisconsin, and while brome grass does very well in Wisconsin, it's probably not going to do as well as we move into the transition zone states like Kentucky and Virginia and Tennessee. So make sure you choose varieties and species that you know are well adapted here. We've got a great variety testing program at the University of Kentucky, probably one of the best in the country. In your manual, I think there, at the very end, there's a long-term summary of variety trials in there, and we can talk to you more about how to use that, or you can talk to your extension agent is a good source for using that data. And you can choose varieties that we know are well adapted here. So just things to think about when you select the forage species. Regional adaptation is at the top of the list. Adaptation to the soils on your farm. So alfalfa is a great forage, and it's well adapted to Kentucky, but not adapted to all soils in Kentucky. If I have poorly drained soils and bottomland, alfalfa is not a good choice. It doesn't like it's not wet-natured soils. So it's important to choose forage species that are adapted not only to the region, but also the soils on your farm. Yield, nutritive value, or considerations, drought and heat tolerance. Probably the most important one is persistence. We want to choose things that we know are going to persist within the grazing system. I can give a little bit of yield up if I've got something I know is going to be there from year to year. And these are just some growth curves. And again, I'm not going to spend any time on this. 2 or 3 of us talked about these. But cool seasons are going to be productive in the spring, and the second shot of growth in the fall. Warm seasons, all that growth is going to be concentrated in the summer months. Our cool season annuals tend to have a little bit of production in the fall, but most of their production will come in early spring and early to mid-spring. Talk just a little bit about grazing management. And Ray did a good job talking about forage plant growth and grazing management yesterday. But I want to mention it because it's an important part of rejuvenating a rundown farm is implementing good rotational grazing. And it all comes down to helping cattle or sheep or whatever you're grazing make good choices. If you leave them to their own devices, the choices they make are not going to be good, I can guarantee you. So it's about helping them make the right choice when it comes to grazing management. And we want to base, when we rotate in a pasture, say I want to rotate at 4 inches. Do animals graze pastures evenly? No, not usually. And so if I wait until every blade of grass in that pasture has been grazed to 4 inches, then most of it is going to be grazed way too close. So we really need to make decisions on when to rotate animals based not on a time period, but rather on a residual height. And we want to choose that residual height to kind of rotate them when we've reached the residual height and at the shortest grass in the pasture. We want to leave plenty of leaf area because that's going to capture sunlight and fuel regrowth. And then we want to manage carbohydrate reserves. And we manage carbohydrate reserves by allowing pastures to rest between grazing events. Whole basis of rotational stocking. We're managing 2 things with rotational stocking. How close we graze, how big that solar panel is that we leave after we graze, and then how long that pasture rests between grazing events. When we combine those 2 things, that's really a powerful management tool for improving pasture health. And then maintain botanical composition at about 30% legumes. So when we talk about rotational stocking, you know, you've got to go into it with the right attitude. Don't do it because Ray told you to do it, or I told you to do it, or Kevin Laurent told you to do it. Do it because you want to. If you go into it and say, well, this is never going to work, chances of you being successful are going to be slim, very slim. You're going to have problems, you're going to have floods and droughts and other roadblocks, but if you've got the right attitude, you're going to kind of find your way around those problems. Okay, I think I'm coming close to the end, Ray. 5 minutes. So water is key. So we talked about that, and Kevin talked about that in pasture layout. Jeff talked about it. Where we put our water is absolutely critical, and you have got to be responsible for that yourself. Don't count on the NRCS to come out to your farm and choose the exact spot. They're going to help you, and they're going to get you in about the right spot, but you've got to be planning ahead. So don't plan on what you want to do tomorrow. Plan on what you want to do in 2 or 3 years. So, and that's going to be key in your water placement. So place your water so that you can intensify management as you move forward. You only get one chance with water, right? Manage your residual height and your rest period. One thing that I want to mention that we don't talk enough about in terms of rotational stocking is drought management within grazing systems. One of the things that people that switch from a continuous to a rotational stocking system notice is that as they go into a drought, their pastures grow longer. As they come out of that drought, their pastures come out faster. So that's related to management prior to that drought, and that's primarily rotational grazing. So when we rotationally graze a pasture, we tend to have larger, stronger root systems in that pasture, and that's going to be more drought tolerant. And it's going to allow that pasture to come out of that drought faster. We also improve nutrient cycles, and we also can manage botanical composition. And then a lot of times people will say, well, you know, I don't want to move animals every 12 hours or every day or every 2 days. I always tell people that the system that you design has got to meet your needs. If you're somebody that works a public job and you want to move animals on Sunday after church, then you design your system so that you make weekly moves within that system. It's got to meet your wants and needs. And make sure you build flexibility. Whatever you do with your fencing and your watering system, build flexibility in, because as you become better grazers, you're going to want to intensify management as you move forward. Just mention weed control real quick in pastures. A lot of times we think of weeds as the problem, but really they're a symptom of a problem. They're a symptom of overgrazing, a symptom of poor soil fertility. Not all weeds, as Matt alluded to, are terrible to have in your pastures. There's actually some weeds that sheep and small ruminants will prefer in a pasture. And Ozzy Abay did a neat little study where she looked at this is in vitro dry matter digestibility, so how digestible these different weeds are. And she compared them to alfalfa. In a vegetative state, things like pigweed and common ragweed were very similar to alfalfa. Now, when they get 6 feet tall, they're going to be less digestible, right? The point that I want to make is that having a few weeds in your pasture is not the end of the world. If you try to have a weed-free pasture, you're going to lose your mind because you'll never do it. But when we start to manage in a rotational stocking system, the animals are grazing not only the forage, but also the weeds, and that's kind of a control mechanism also. Well, we kind of talked about this. I'll just mention that we do have some very good herbicides available for weed control in pastures. And I mean, they just kill weeds dead. So what happens? I get a weed in my pasture, I go to the co-op, I say, I've got this weed, and they say, oh yeah, I know what that is. I got something for it. So they apply that herbicide to your pasture, the weed dies, right? We got great herbicides. What's left when that weed dies? Bare ground. What grows in bare ground? Exactly. So the point that I want to make is that when we think about weed control in pastures, it's got to be an integrated approach. Can't be just applying herbicide. If we just apply herbicide, it's like a revolving door. We've got to figure out why we lost that. Was it poor grazing management? Was it poor soil fertility? Is my lime not right in my pasture? And then once we do that, we can use herbicides judiciously as a management tool for hard to manage weeds. All right, I'm going to move forward here. Okay, I'm about at the end of my 5 minutes, so I'm going to finish up with my pasture revitalization checklist. So if you've got pastures, they've come through a stressful event like we've had last summer, we need to rest those pastures after stressful events. The rest periods need to be longer than they normally would be in the spring. We need to soil test and adjust fertility. We need to choose adapted forage species, implement rotational stocking, control broadleaf weeds, incorporate legumes into grazing systems, absolutely a key component of grazing systems, and then reseed pastures as a very last resort in most cases, with the exception of novel endophyte. Novel endophyte may constitute a complete reseeding process. All right, is there any questions? Like Tifton 44? Yeah, Tifton 44 I think would be adapted to Western Kentucky probably. It's got decent cold tolerance.
There's also several seeded types that would probably be a little easier to get established. That's the spring type.
So watch for your extension. We're going to have a field day this summer hopefully in Livingston County. We put out a on-farm demonstration with 3 different seeded Bermuda grass types. We also have a seeded Bermuda grass in Nicky's County. Where's Nicky at? Jake Shadowan has one that's been there for, I don't know, 3 years? 3rd year now. So, and it looks good. So there are some options for improved seeded Bermuda grasses that have increased cold tolerance. Any other questions?
To reduce the effect of tall fescue on your animals, you say it's increased mix grass or edibles. Can you just put novel endophyte fescue as part of that component?
I'll let Ray answer that. Ray?
So fescue seedlings are not very competitive with mature fescue. So it's hard to get novel fescue into an established stand. Orchard grass, you'd have a better chance because it's quite shade tolerant. So that's why we'd like to say yes, and it may be possible, but our experience has shown that if you want novel fescue, and especially with the cost of seed, you're better just to kill out your existing stand and start over. Then you know you've got safe fescue, rather than trying to incorporate it in.
And you would never do that on your whole farm. You would do it in a little bit at a time, over time. So the other thing to remember about tall fescue toxicosis is that the toxins in tall fescue are not toxic to animals in parts per million, but parts per billion. So it's a very small level of toxins that can cause adverse effects in animals.